Hey everybody, and welcome to this continuing study of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. We're going to be looking at Stave III, which is the second of the three spirits. We've already had the Ghost of Christmas Past, who's visited with Ebenezer Scrooge and shown him images from, obviously, from his past, and affected Scrooge a great deal. So we're going to look at the second of the three spirits. And so early on in the chapter, in the stave, Ebenezer Scrooge obviously is very wary of what's going to come next, because Jacob Marley told him he'd have three spirits come and see him. So, and the second one shows up, he actually tries to get ready. So he opens his bed curtains up and tries to prepare for that, and so he's not caught off guard like he was with the Ghost of Christmas Past. But nothing. The hour comes and nothing happens, and so he's a little concerned about that. And he realizes there's something coming from the other room. So what he does is he goes across there, opens up the door, and he's greeted by this giant. It's often portrayed, with Scrooge looking at this giant man dressed in a green robe with white trimming. He's sitting on a throne of geese, of cooked, ducks and turkeys and geese and fruits and vegetables and all sorts of things on there. He's also very jolly and happy. He holds a torch that's very much in the shape of a horn of plenty. And he's jolly. He also wears a scabbard, but no sword in it. And the scabbard is actually rusty, and that's symbolic of the fact that the Ghost of Christmas Present has no interest in doing violent things. He is a man of peace and of love, and so that's why he has that there. Scrooge is taken aback by his jolliness a little bit. This spirit is quite different than the Ghost of Christmas Past. Present is happy. He laughs a lot. He's very jovial, and he takes Scrooge throughout the streets of London, shows him all the businesses, sees people enjoying the holiday, the business people buying and selling, and as he goes along, he sprinkles his torch on the different people going around, and of course Scrooge is interested in that and asks, is there a particular flavor that you sprinkle from your torch? And of course the spirit says, well, yes, there is. It's mine own. And he talks about how he blesses a poor dinner because it needs it the most. Then Scrooge gets into a conversation with the spirit about the seventh day, which was a law in London at that time, that none of the businesses would be open. Well, that was the only day basically that the poor were allowed to had basically any time off. And so they didn't have the opportunity to go out and dine and do those things that other people who had money and wealth could do. And so he kind of says, well, Scrooge says, it's been done in your name. I don't know if it's right or not. And the spirit basically tells him that people have claimed to do things in their name, and they are as foreign to them as anybody else. And in fact, he says, there are those who lay claim to know us and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, and who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin as if they had never lived. Remember that and charge their doings on themselves, not to us. So when people do things in the name of these heavenly creatures, the spirit tells him that, well, they do that on their own. That's all them. So when they keep people from being able to go out and do these things, that's all them. That's not us. And so Scrooge is kind of put in his place there. They take him then, the spirit takes him to Bob Cratchit's house, and we see Cratchit. He lives in Camden Town, which is a working class neighborhood, poor, very humble. And he meets the Cratchits, and he sees the little children, and Bob is not there. He's gone to church with Tiny Tim, their youngest child, who is sick. He has wears a brace on his leg and has a crutch. But you see the Cratchits, they don't have very much as far as worldly possessions are concerned, but they are very happy with each other. They love being with each other. They even play a game when Martha, the oldest, shows up and hides from Bob when he comes in. And, of course, Bob kind of knows that they're fooling around, and Martha hides from him, and he's like, she comes out and says, oh, Father, and Martha, and they hug, and they have a good time together. And the children then help Tim off to the side into another room to hear the pudding singing in the copper, which is to hear the pudding that they're cooking for their dessert hissing inside the copper pot that they're cooking it in. And then Bob and Mrs. Cratchit talk about going to church, and Mrs. Cratchit asked Bob how Tim behaved, and he says as good as gold and better. And he says something like, you know, he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. So here you have this child who has every reason to be angry with the world, so to speak, because of his disability and because of his sickness, an illness which many modern doctors today would probably say would be curable, but they didn't have the money to get a doctor. But he has every reason to be angry, and he's not. He's happy. He enjoys his family. He loves his father very much and his mother. And but he says that he's glad that people see him as a cripple because it's good for Christians to see that, to remember who this day that they're celebrating, the day that, of course, an allusion, a reference to Jesus, who would heal the sick and the lame and help the beggars. And it was good for them to remember that. And so that's the kind of spirit that Tim has. Well, they have their dinner, and it's a very humble dinner, but everybody's happy to have it. So there's an example of what it might have looked like. And they have their goose and so forth, and they bring the pudding out. And of course, during the meal, Scrooge looks at the spirit and asks if Tiny Tim will live. Well, the spirit says that he sees a vacant seat by the poor chimney corner and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. And he says, if these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. Well, Scrooge then says, well, no, tell me he will live. Then the spirit uses his own words against him from Stave I and says, well, if he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Meaning, you know, these are the surplus population you were talking about, Scrooge. You know, these sicklings, these poor people who, of course, Scrooge thinks they're poor simply because they're lazy, which is not always the truth. But you know, he says that and uses Scrooge's words against him, his own words against him. And of course, Scrooge is kind of put in his place, so to speak, and there's a point to it. And they bring out the pudding, and it's a success. And they, you know, it's not a big portion. Not everybody gets a whole lot, but the Cratchits would never complain because that would be being ungrateful. And then as Scrooge is sort of coming out of his being sent, you know, to repentance, so to speak, about what he said, they have a toast to Mr. Scrooge as the founder of the feast. And Mrs. Cratchit doesn't really care for that very much because she calls him an odious and stingy, hard, unfeeling man. And of course, Bob says, well, not in front of the children. He does pay my salary, so to speak. And of course, Scrooge sees how they actually feel about him. Bob actually defends him in some way because he does have income. But that whole thing cast a pall upon the whole time. It wasn't a good 5 minutes until later that they actually got back into being hearty and celebrating again because of just the mere mention of Scrooge's name. Well, after that, Scrooge takes him around to different places. He takes him to a place where miners live, and they're mining probably coal or something else. And here they are in these very humble circumstances, and, you know, of course, working in a mine is not the most glamorous work, but these men are celebrating Christmas in their own way. This ghost takes him out to a ship where you have men celebrating out on the open seas. You have them in a lighthouse all by themselves celebrating Christmas, and all these people are celebrating Christmas and the holidays, and Scrooge is not. Then he ends up at later in the stave. He ends up at Fred's house, his nephew, and they're having a good time, a good party, and they're enjoying themselves, and they're discussing what happened with Ebenezer when he went to see his uncle, and he said Christmas. You know, he said that Scrooge called Christmas a humbug. But Fred doesn't. You know, all the other people at the party have no patience for Scrooge. They think he's a terrible man. But Fred, because that's his one relative, and because he loves his uncle, even though the uncle's terribly rude to him and mean to him, he offers to go there every year to wish him a Merry Christmas, and hopefully one day he'll actually accept an invitation to Christmas dinner. And they have some games. They play forfeits, and they play Blind Man's Buff, and that's a funny part where Topper's chasing around the plump sister, as Dickens describes her, and they get caught behind the curtains, and so that's a big laugh. And they're having such a good time. And Fred is the polar opposite of Scrooge. He loves life. He loves his friends and his wife. They also play a game called Yes and No, kind of like our version of 20 Questions. And they talk about it being a wild animal, a savage animal, because Fred's thinking of an animal, you know, an animal that lives in London and, you know, it doesn't live in a menagerie, which is a zoo, so to speak. And it ends up being Uncle Scrooge, which is funny because, you know, he's not an animal, but he is a savage animal, so to speak. And, of course, Scrooge is hearing this whole thing, and he has to listen to that. But at the end, Fred offers the toast to his uncle and wishes him the best. And so Scrooge gets to see that his nephew does love him. After the party, things kind of change. Scrooge notices that the spirit has changed quite a bit. He's gotten older. His hair has gone gray. He is not as hearty in his laughing and his he's not as, you know, jocund. And so he notices that and asks if, you know, are spirits' lives so short? And he says, well, yes, mine ends tonight at midnight. He says, listen, the clock is about to strike. Well, sure enough, it does. And as he looks, Scrooge seems to sense something beneath the robes of the spirit, of the ghost of Christmas Present. And he asks, well, what is that, a claw? And he says, well, it may very well be a claw for all the flesh there is upon it. And he says, look. And he pulls back his robes. And probably one of the most disturbing scenes in the entire book. There are two children underneath, a boy and a girl. And they are terrible to behold because they look diseased. They are filthy. They are in rags. Scrooge is startled and taken aback by the whole thing. It's a terrible scene to behold. And of course he asks, well, are they yours, spirit? And the spirit says, they are man's. And let me read what it says here. And they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both in all their degree, but most of all beware this boy. For on his brow I see that written which is doom, lest the writing be erased. So the children, the girl is want and the boy is ignorance. Now the ignorance he's talking about is the ignorance of not knowing something. I mean, people who can be ignorant of things, it doesn't mean they're stupid. There's a difference. But ignorance in this case is the fact that there's two types of ignorance. Ignorance, you just don't know something, and the second type is you just don't want to know. And Scrooge doesn't want to know about the plight of the poor. He doesn't want to know about people who struggle. He worried only about his own business and doesn't worry about other people's, as he says in the very beginning. And so ignorance is the worst of the two because you ignore what the problem is and don't try to solve it and try to help as best you can, even in a small way. And of course, well, then Scrooge asks, well, have they no refuge? Have they no resource? Have they no place to go? Have they nobody to help them? And the two, you know, and then of course the spirit again uses Scrooge's words against him and says, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? Saying that's where Scrooge thinks these people should go when they're poor. And so Scrooge is again left by himself, and we end up Stave III with the spirit leaving him, and as he looks up, the next spirit has already shown up, and it's a phantom that he's never seen before, very scary. It looks somewhat like the Grim Reaper with a hood over his head. You can't see his face. There's only one hand that protrudes out of the cloak. He's dark. He's covered in, you know, in a blackness, and it actually really freaks Scrooge out, as it probably would most of us, right? So that ends Stave 3. So that's some of the important things that happen in Stave 3, and so hopefully that will take a look at this video to go over these things. It doesn't replace reading it, because it's always great to read it to yourself and get your own ideas out of it and experience it for yourself. So that's Stave 3 of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol.